Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadline so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. So much of your personal info is out of your control, like your insurance provider that has your social security number and your favorite retailer that has your payment details. If they get breached, your information, your identity, is vulnerable. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This is an ad for BetterHelp. Welcome to the world. Please read your personal owner's manual thoroughly. In it, you'll find simple instructions for how to interact with your fellow human beings and how to find happiness and peace of mind. Thank you, and have a nice life.
Unfortunately, life doesn't come with an owner's manual. That's why there's BetterHelp Online Therapy. Connect with a credentialed therapist by phone, video, or online chat. Visit BetterHelp.com to learn more. That's BetterHelp.com.
EVO. This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. It began long before the candy corn, the jack-o'-lanterns, and the costumes, before the black cats crossed our paths, and before children whispered about ghosts as they wandered dark streets in search of candy. Halloween as we know it is a thin veneer, a mask that conceals something ancient, something older than anyone alive can remember. It wasn't always a night of harmless tricks and delicious treats. Once upon a time, it was a night of dread and fear. A night when the veil between worlds was so fragile, you could almost feel the breath of the dead on your neck. People didn't wear masks to celebrate. They wore them to hide. And they weren't hiding from their neighbors. They were hiding from something else. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to the history of Halloween. It began with Samhain, the ancient Celtic festival that marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of the dark, cold winter. Now, as a quick aside here, I feel like this is a good place to explain that one of the many pitfalls for people like myself who lack a more conventional, formal education is the pronunciation of certain words. You should hear me butcher the names of the ancient Greeks that I've read, because I've only read them. I've never heard those names spoken aloud by a professor or someone with higher levels of scholarship regarding the ancient Greeks than I happen to possess. In this case, the word is Samhain. It's spelled Samhain, and that's how I've pronounced it to myself over the years when I've come across it in the written form. Samhain. Nope, it's actually Samhain. But how was I supposed to know that? I haven't studied ancient Celtic languages. I've never even been to Ireland. There are other words like that in this episode, but I just wanted to say, you know what? You do you. Pronounce things however you want, as long as you keep reading. And if you ever want a really good laugh, go and look up some of your more adventurous pronunciations. It happens to me all the time. Anyway, so the Celts believed that on October 31st, the boundary between the living and the dead blurred. On this night, spirits both vengeful and benign could slip into our world, roaming the fields and forests, seeking warmth, or perhaps something far darker. They knew the winds of Samhain weren't just cold because winter was coming. They were cold because they carried the breath of the dead. October's my favorite month of the year. And not only because summer's over and the weather turns cold and I can wear my cool sweaters, not only because I'm a huge baseball fan and there's nothing like October baseball, but because Halloween is my favorite holiday. It's my wife's favorite holiday, it's my kids' favorite holiday, and we go all out. Our house looks really creepy, we have huge pumpkin carving extravaganzas. It's a very festive time. So in that spirit, I wanted to dedicate a few episodes to the history of Halloween and hopefully gain a few converts. So the Celts were a superstitious people, but for good reason. Life was precarious, and the line between life and death was so thin, not unlike the veil that separated our world from the one beyond. And fire was their shield, their light in the ever-encroaching darkness. Bonfires were lit not only to keep warm, but to protect. You see, the fire kept the things at bay, the things that came crawling from the shadows as the year began to die. They weren't just afraid of ghosts. They were afraid of the Ishi. Man, you should see how that one's spelled. They were afraid of the Ishi, the spirits of the dead and the ancient Fae, beings older than time, neither wholly good nor entirely evil, but dangerous all the same. The kind of creatures that didn't knock on your door for candy. They broke it down. And in the flickering light of those great fires, the Celts would dress in animal skins and masks, hoping that if one of these otherworldly beings passed by, it wouldn't recognize them as human. The costumes we wear today are nothing more than echoes of this practice, a faint shadow of a far more terrifying reality. But the fires didn't always work. Sometimes the Ishi would still come, and when they did, there was no stopping them. As the centuries marched on, conquering armies arrived. Romans, who looked upon the festival with a mix of curiosity and disdain. But even the Romans, with their grand gods and rigid pantheons, weren't immune to the dark. They incorporated some of the Celtic practices, blending their own festivals of Feralia, a day when the Romans commemorated the dead, and Pomona, a celebration of the goddess of fruits and trees. The Feast of Apples merged into Samhain, and the autumn harvest mingled with the remembrance of the dead. It was a slow corruption, a merging of traditions, each one feeding the other like a snake devouring its own tail. It was during this time that the jack-o'-lantern came into being, though in those early days, it wasn't carved into a smiling pumpkin. No, the faces were grotesque, etched into turnips or beets, and they weren't placed on doorsteps for decoration. They were warnings. The burning eyes of the jack-o'-lanterns stared into the night, telling whatever was out there to stay back. You don't belong here, they seemed to say. But sometimes the things in the dark don't listen. It wasn't long before the church, with its own cold grasp, laid claim to the festival. Christianity spread like a creeping shadow over Europe, and the church sought to suppress Samhain's pagan roots. But darkness has a way of clinging to places, of holding on. The church renamed the holiday All Hallows' Eve, the night before All Saints' Day, a holy day to honor the saints and martyrs. But even they couldn't scrub the fear from the bones of the people. For centuries, the two festivals coexisted, one bathed in light, the other draped in darkness. By the Middle Ages, the festival had spread across Europe, growing in both legend and horror. The fear of witches, women who were believed to consort with the very spirits Samhain once welcomed, crept into the popular consciousness. They said that on Halloween night, witches gathered to perform rituals that opened doorways, summoning the damned and demons alike. It's no surprise then that masks grew more elaborate. People weren't just trying to blend in with the spirits anymore. They were hoping to fool the witches too. And when the bonfires dimmed and the winds howled through the villages, the people could feel the presence of something older than even their oldest legends. A deep, abiding terror had taken root, one that echoed with the whispered promise of darkness. Samhain, once a festival of the turning seasons, had become something else entirely. Even as the festival of Samhain transformed into All Hallows Eve, the dead still wandered. People still heard whispers in the wind, still felt that unmistakable shiver down their spine as October nights grew longer. The fear wasn't just a leftover superstition, it was a deep-rooted instinct. On Halloween, people still felt that invisible line, that fragile thread between life and death, fraying slightly at the edges. During the medieval period, this blurring of worlds took on a darker, more sinister tone. The dead weren't simply benign spirits visiting to partake in harvest offerings. Now they'd grown twisted and angry. The church taught us of purgatory, a place where souls were trapped in agony until they could find redemption, and these tortured spirits wandered on Halloween, seeking solace or vengeance or worse. The tradition of, quote, souling began during this time. Poor villagers would go door to door, offering prayers for the dead in exchange for small cakes, known as soul cakes. The belief was that each cake eaten represented a soul freed from purgatory, ascending into the afterlife. But even in the act of saving souls, there was fear. What if you failed to give a cake? What if you shut your door on the wrong person, the wrong spirit? And sometimes the knockers weren't just beggars. Sometimes it wasn't a living voice on the other side of that door. The trick-or-treating of today is merely a sanitized echo of this old tradition, one that replaced prayers with candy and masked the fear behind smiling jack-o'-lanterns and cheerful costumes. But in those days, no one smiled when they entered the door on Halloween night. No one dared.
Streaming only on Peacock.
Being with Finch felt like I was in some fairy tale.
She's like, I write for Grey's Anatomy. I was like, what?
Her writing was so highly regarded because Finch had been through so much.
A Hollywood writer's life.
When you love somebody, you'll ignore red flags so they're hitting you in the head.
Filled with fiction.
She would do whatever it takes to get ahead.
She's sort of like a TV series.
I don't know who my wife is.
Anatomy of Lies. Streaming October 15th. Only on Peacock.
It was all a lie.
As the centuries trudged onward, so too did the hysteria of the witch hunts. Halloween became a focal point of fear for another reason: the supposed witches' Sabbath. People spoke of dark gatherings in the woods where witches, those believed to consort with the devil himself, where witches would summon spirits, perform forbidden rituals, and curse anyone who dared to oppose them. The witch hunts that tore through Europe and eventually the Americas weren't just born of superstition. They were a symptom of the paranoia that had taken root in people's hearts. Halloween, with its already shadowy past, became the night when the witches were said to gather in power. Fires were no longer just bonfires to keep the spirits at bay. They became pyres for burning those accused of witchcraft. The fear of witches was so potent that even the sight of a broomstick could make a village tremble. And as legend has it, a black cat crossing your path on Halloween was not just an omen of bad luck. It was said that witches transformed into these creatures to move unseen. When the sky grew dark on Halloween, people would clutch their crucifixes, convinced that the witches' hour had arrived. But the witches weren't the only ones the people feared. There were other things lurking in the woods, darker things. In the quiet, rural stretches of Europe, and later in the fledgling American colonies, farmers lived by the cycle of the seasons. They tilled the earth, planted their seeds, and harvested their crops in accordance with nature's unforgiving clock. But Halloween wasn't just about the spirits of the dead. It was a marker of the turning of the year, the final gasp before winter arrived. And winter brought more than just cold. In the dark, isolated farms, people told tales of the harvest man, a spirit who watched over the crops as they withered and died. He was said to appear as the last of the harvest was brought in, a figure shrouded in shadows, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. No one knew where the tale began, but it spread like wildfire across the countryside. Farmers would hurry to finish their harvest before Halloween, because if you weren't done by then, the harvest man would come for you. Some claimed he was a ghost, the spirit of a farmer who had died before finishing his work and was condemned to walk the fields for all eternity. Others whispered that he was something far older, a creature of the earth itself, rising from the soil to reclaim what was his. Whatever the case, the sight of unharvested fields on Halloween night was enough to produce feelings of abject terror for a believer. It was said that if you saw the harvest man in your fields, you had one option: run, because once he sets his sights on you, there was no escape. And sometimes, as the stories went, the harvest man wouldn't be alone. They'd say that the fields weren't just haunted by the spirits of dead farmers, but by something darker, something that had been there since the beginning of time. The Celts, this is what they called the Ishi. Others called them demons, but the name didn't matter. What mattered was the hunger in their eyes, and the way the crops would wither in their wake. By the time Halloween night had passed, there was only one thing left to do: lock your doors and pray. Because if the harvest man didn't get you, the others might. So when Halloween finally crossed the Atlantic to the American colonies, it was carried not only by the Irish and Scottish immigrants, but by the weight of centuries of fear and superstition. Here in the New World, the old stories took on new shapes, melding with the folk traditions of the Native Americans and the new fears of the untamed land. In early America, Halloween was a quieter affair at first. The Puritans, deeply religious and suspicious of anything that reeked of paganism, shunned the holiday altogether. But fear has a way of surviving, even in the harshest climates. Ghost stories spread throughout the colonies, and by the time the 1800s rolled around, Halloween began to take root once more, growing from the shadows like a vine creeping up an abandoned house. The traditions of Samhain, of souling, and the fear of witches mixed with the strange New World. The pumpkin, larger and easier to carve than the turnips of Europe, became the face of Halloween, its grinning visage a symbol of both celebration and warning. But even as the holiday grew more playful, the undercurrent of dread never fully disappeared. The harvest man still lurked in the fields, the spirits of the dead still wandered the streets. And the veil between worlds, it was as thin as ever. By the early 20th century, Halloween had taken on a more light-hearted tone in America. It was a night for children to dress up for parties and games like bobbing for apples. But beneath the laughter and fun, there was still something darker lurking. Mischief Night. The night before Halloween became a time for pranks and tricks. Harmless at first, but then the pranks grew meaner and crueler. Some said it was the influence of the spirits. Others blamed the energy of the night itself. But every year, windows were broken, fires were set, and sometimes people went missing. The local papers would chalk it up to mischief, a bit of roughhousing gone too far. But there were always whispers. Whispers that said the ones who went missing had crossed paths with something they shouldn't have. That on Mischief Night, something old walked the streets, taking its pick of the unlucky. And when the bodies were never found, the whispers grew only louder. By the 1950s, Halloween had become the holiday we recognize today. Costumes, candy, and haunted houses. But even in this era of commercialization, the old traditions refused to die. People still carve faces into pumpkins, we still wear masks to ward off spirits, and even if we're not realizing why we do it. But sometimes, masks don't just hide you from spirits, they invite them in. In towns across America, there were stories of children who donned masks on Halloween night and were never quite the same afterwards. Maybe it was just the power of imagination, or maybe it was something more sinister. Parents would speak of children who wore their masks too long and began to act different. Their voices would change, their eyes would seem hollow, and sometimes they would say things or have information that they couldn't possibly possess. And when the mask finally came off, sometimes it wasn't the child underneath. No one ever talked about those kids for long. They disappeared into the folds of memory as if they'd never been there at all. But every year, when Halloween rolled around again, the parents would watch their children a little more closely, wondering if this time the mask would decide to stay. Halloween is a night of contradictions. Yes, a time for celebration, and yes, it's steeped in the fear of what lies beyond. We light our jack-o'-lanterns to ward off the darkness, but deep down, we know that the darkness is always there, waiting. The ancient Celts knew it, the Romans knew it, and even today, when we dress up in costumes and give out candy, a part of us knows it too. Because Halloween isn't just a night for the dead. It's a reminder that the line between their world and ours is always fragile. And on this one night more than any other, that line is at its thinnest. So as you light your pumpkin and put on your costume, remember, the masks you wear might be hiding something more than just your face. Thanks for listening and happy Halloween. Make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and remember, full episodes are available if you're a YouTube person. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Danny Abelson. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.